Well, thank you for joining us today to the special event, De-Risk of the U.S. China Relationship, ? And this virtual public program is brought to you by a partnership between United States Heartland China Association and University of Missouri, St. Louis, we call UMSL. And this event actually took place earlier in an in-person format on the campus. And we are so glad that we are able to invite back our partner and our speakers again for this public event virtually. And my name is Min Fan. I'm the Executive Director of the United States Heartland China Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit committed to promoting exchange between U.S. Heartland and China in culture, education, and business. So let me briefly introduce the four wonderful experts we have today. First, we have Ed Monser, who was the president of Emerson Electric, iconic American company, a global industrial controls products company. He was the president from 2010 until his retirement in 2018. So Ed, you had the perfect timing and retired before the world hit a dramatic change point. At the time of his retirement, Ms. Monser had more than 30 years experience in senior operational position at Emerson, and also formerly, and Ed was vice chairman of the U.S. India Strategic Partnership Forum, and also a member of the Economic Development Board for China's Guangdong province, and the director and vice chairman of the U.S. China Business Council. Also with us today is Hangge Feng, and who is Dr. Y.S. Chan Professor of Chinese Studies and Curator Distinguished Professor of Finance and Legal Studies at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, where he served as the department chair for 5 years. He had organized several China-related business conferences and have done training for corporations and for nonprofit organizations as well. We also have dear friend Joe Glassman, who has retired, who was a director of the International Studies Program at UMSL before. He's a specialist in Chinese and Japanese politics and U.S. relations with East Asia. He has published articles in Contemporary China, Asia Quarterly, and Comparative Education. Dr. Glassman, we call Joe, has been involved with the Nanjing Sister City relationship, which is the first pair for the two countries for its entire 40+ year history. So I'm really, really honored to have all four of you here with me today. So when you look at the topic today, and we can put a slide down, De-Risk of the U.S.-China relationship. So we had to update this title because not too long ago, it was called decoupling of the U.S.-China relationship. So from decoupling to de-risk, seems like there's a lot of uncertainty of how to frame what is happening right now. What's the right term to use? What's the right framework to really evaluate the time we are in? So I would like to invite each of you to really help kind of share your perspective on this very confusing, challenging time we're in, whether it's decoupling or de-risk or whatever it should be framed as. First, Ed, as a business leader, you've led multinationals and you watched the growth of global company in China and the transformation in China. What are your thoughts about the de-risk of U.S.-China relationship today?
Well, thank you, man. I was thinking ahead of time, and I realize now that I'm retired and I'm older that I'm less careful with the things I say. So I hope I don't offend anyone. That still would be my intent, but I may say things more bluntly than I had when I was working full time. The whole concept of de-risking, I think, is very important to discuss. But I would like to point out right away that de-risking is not decoupling. Decoupling doesn't lower risk, in my view. De-risking is not isolation or not isolating one country or another, U.S. isolating itself. That does not de-risk things, and I'll point to that. It's not disengaging. It's not stopping talking to one another. That does not de-risk. All these things have been proposed, of course, as things that would help. And it's not a we win, they lose. Whoever the we and they are, anything you negotiate, anything you work out where there's somebody who wins and somebody that loses is usually a problem and not something that lowers risk. It is, in fact, de-risking is deepening the dialogue, much like the U.S. China Heartland Association is so dedicated to. It's finding areas of cooperation, solving problems together. And the main case that I would want to make is it is competing. And it is the U.S. and China competing with one another in the global economy. And as we both go out and compete with each other, I think that's probably the most important way of de-risking. Now, before I go into details on that, since I'm the first speaker, I just wanted to make a couple comments on what's often called Beijing bashing. And it's not an unusual thing in the U.S. And I don't know if you can see this newspaper that I pulled out of my office from 1972, but I was just so excited in 1972 because that's when Nixon met with Mao. And here he is with Zhou Enlai having tea and other things that were going on. When President Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, he didn't just invite an isolated, at that time, an underdeveloped nation into the outside world. He ensured that China would become what's called the punching bag of U.S. politics. And a lot of what we get in terms of negative things said in the press and said publicly come from the political side of things. Every 4 years, we get a bigger dose of this. Ronald Reagan was very good at China or Beijing bashing. Bill Clinton, who turned out to do a lot of things that promoted growth in China when he was a candidate, was bashing China. George W. Bush, Donald Trump, of course. But each of them, when they came to office, then they changed their tune and started to do things that were constructive for the relationship. So I think as we think about de-risking and decoupling and any of these things that create tension, first of all, note that it's a long history that usually ends up with people using common sense. And even Donald Trump, after he became president, if you'll remember, started praising Xi Jinping, and he clearly was marveling at him until COVID started, and then that changed a lot of things. The current trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship is very poor, I would say, after watching this for decades. And any 180-degree turn that we're used to is going to be more and more difficult. The Republicans right now, Trump, DeSantis, Nikki Haley, all are being very aggressive in the things they say about China. And even the Democratic candidate, President Biden, finding it very difficult to say something positive or constructive about China in any form. So that's kind of the world of news that we live in. So I think de-risking is definitely needed. It's needed by folks like us that are talking together, the 150 to 200 of us that are tonight thinking about this, to prevent this relationship from plummeting further. And I don't like to say these words, but these words are on the agenda, that there could be a war between rival superpowers. And I think having this dialogue and being aggressive on our side of things is very important. Now, our side, I'll take the case for business. And what does business have to do? And how can business de-risk things? The number one role, of course, is competing in the global economy. very critical for overall economic growth, which kind of underpins everything we try to do. And I'll also make the case that business out working in the global economy enhances the opportunity for global peace. And we'll talk to that for a second. The business case for competing in the global economy is actually pretty straightforward, at least the way I see it. I thought Lester Thoreau, the MIT economist who's said a number of smart things over the years, he put it very simply: he who wins the biggest market wins the world in terms of business. Winning the biggest market gives the winner a superior leverage on their cost. And that can be used to win in other markets. So you go to the biggest market, you win there, you get the leverage from the biggest market, you take that cost advantage to the smaller markets, you're very tough to compete with. You said one way, another way is you're in a very good position to win. So we sit here right now and we get kind of centered on thinking of the U.S., of course. The U.S. is 4% of the global population. That means 96% of the global population is outside the U.S. With the dramatic growth of the global middle class, the U.S., for many segments of the global economy, is not the biggest market. Often, the biggest market today is China. Now, let me tell you an example of how these things work out. And I'm going to use an Emerson example that I got to experience. And it was fascinating intellectually, difficult from a business perspective. But at one point in time in the history of Emerson, it was the #1 appliance motor maker in the world. And it was the #1 appliance motor maker in the United States. It was the #1 appliance motor maker in Europe. And as Asia and China came into the global economy and grew in the global economy, Emerson was late going to Asia, was late going to China, and ultimately lost to an Asian supplier who got the market, turned out to be the biggest market, got the leverage. And do you think that they just stayed in China happy and said, we've done everything we need to do, we're fine, we'll just take care of China? No. They went to Europe. And it didn't take long that we were displaced in Europe by a very strong Chinese and Asian competitor. And then, do you think they were satisfied then? No. They came to the United States, where we had been #1 for decades in this market. And they went to our biggest customer, who had 100% sourced product from us for decades, and said, no, we're going to try this new supplier. And ultimately, we lost. We lost the business globally, and ultimately, we were out of the business. So it can be very real. It can happen very quickly. That whole process took 8 to 12 years. It's not turn on a dime sometimes, but it's an avalanche anyways. All right, that gets you to, you need to go to China and you need to win in the Chinese market if you're going to win the biggest market. If you're a U.S. company, it's very difficult to do that from the U.S. You have to get local. And I want to give some details on that. For me, personally, I had the experience of working in China while I was at Emerson. for decades, going and working in China. I'm currently the lead director at a company called Air Products and Chemical. Their biggest market is China, a U.S. company headquartered in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I'm on the board of a company called Vertiv Holding that makes internet equipment in Columbus, Ohio. Their biggest market is China. It has been for some time. And for Emerson, while we're there, it was always the second biggest market. Not always, but through most of the time. I would say from my experience with the U.S. China Business Council and others, U.S. companies have been, are, and I would project very welcome in China. The Chinese government this year, 2023, has been the most aggressive with U.S. investment in China. We are welcome to go. To win in China, of course, not easy, but doable, as I've experienced over and over again. The key thing is to be local. You're not going to manufacture goods in the United States and sell them in China and win. Unfortunately, if you want to win in China, you have to have manufacturing in China. You can lever your costs across factories around the world, but you need to be local. You need to sell and market in China. You need to engineer in China. You need to innovate, invent things in China if you really want to be competitive. And bottom line, you have to design your products for the Chinese market. Simple things like the grid, the electrical grid in China performs and behaves and is designed different than the grid in North America. Your products need to accommodate that. You can take a really great product from Ohio and take it to China. It doesn't work. So you have to be local. Now, what would happen if you don't go to China and you don't try to win there? Your European competitors will, and they'll get the leverage, and then they'll come after you in the United States. Or a competitor in China will come up out of China, just like what happened with the motor business, and they'll go to Europe and win, and then they'll come to the US and win. If you want to be in business, you've got to win the biggest market. Now, about North America, very interesting. For many products today, you cannot manufacture in China and win in North America. Now, when I say that to people, they always go, "You must be nuts." From a cost perspective, it used to be 30 years ago, China could be cheaper. China could be lower cost. Between 10 and 15 years ago, that switched. It switched for a number of good reasons, I think. The main thing is the Chinese middle class has been growing. I believe the Chinese middle class on any metric is larger than the U.S. middle class, but it's grown rapidly. The costs have gone up. Skilled labor is significantly more expensive in China than before. And if you look at total cost, North America can be very competitive. So I think it's important to remember that we can win. I did profit planning at Emerson for 70 different businesses. And again, what I saw personally 15 years ago, many of the products we made, if we made them in North America, it was cheaper.
Right.
So we shouldn't be afraid to compete. We can win. And any trend towards isolation is a trend towards losing. As we sit here in the U.S., I'm sorry, that was the other page. All right, I'll be quick and finish up. We are always told how great we are here in the U.S., but we are losing in critical areas. And I think this is because we're not competing in the way that we should. The health of our cities, not good. Education, not good. And now, a lot of complaining about this, but Asia and China in many areas are ahead in technology. Innovation rates are definitely higher in Asia today. 6 of the world's 10 fastest supercomputers are in China. Anybody want to predict who's going to put human beings on Mars first? I'm pretty sure it'll be China. Asia and China are ahead in chips, artificial intelligence, super fast computers, as I said. When I visited Tencent a decade ago, a big internet company, of course, the features they were offering then were well in advance of Facebook, Twitter, and the commercial transactions they supported were well in advance of anything that Amazon had. And finally, in education, 2023 average score of math, science, reading, the PISA program for international student assessment for 15-year-olds. China was number 1, and the US was 25. We must compete. We must not isolate. Can I finish with my world peace?
Please,
Min,
please.
just for a second. Okay. One tool that helps in the development for world peace is economic interdependence. Henry Kissinger pressed this agenda globally, especially with China. He started the U.S. China Business Council to that end. He engaged businesses to go to China, invest in China, invited China to do the same. Economic interdependence makes people think before they start dropping bombs on each other. Those are Henry Kissinger words. And I've always been very concerned when politicians start going after U.S. businesses for being in China. We were invited there by the U.S. government in many cases. And then they want to break the interdependency. Why do they want to do that? Because they think war is a better answer and makes the world much more dangerous. So with that, I went over a little bit. I'm sorry, Min. I'll stop my section.
Well, thank you, Ed, for sharing your deep business expertise. One thing I will mention, I was recently in China, actually in Shanghai, drove by the 3M headquarters. I was reminded that 3M was in China in the 1920s, apparently. Again, it's the situation we find ourselves in is very complex. And I think I would turn to Joe, our political scientist by training, to maybe talk about the foreign policy, national security challenges, and how we end up today where China is actually, if you look at Pew Research, even public opinion is very low of China. So how did we get here? What other, can you maybe share some lights on the moment we're in?
Thank you, Min. Let me start with my underlying core assumption here. Even though the relationship between the United States and China is now regarded as highly problematic and rather unsuccessful over the past 30 to 40 years, I actually would disagree with that. It's been a highly successful and mutually beneficial relationship. And I want to underscore both terms, highly successful and mutually beneficial. Yes, there are real issues and real problems that currently confront the relationship. Some of these are of China's making, some of them are of our making, but they are nonetheless real. But I remain optimistic that a new relationship can be established, a new balance or equilibrium can be identified and sustained. That optimism is based on the shared interest, and has to be based on a shared interest in finding a way to manage the relationship successfully, as we have done in the past. The challenge is to find a way to manage conflict and competition rather than exacerbating the conflict. Of course, we should not be surprised that we have entered a period of conflict and cooperation. The rise of China threatens the United States, and this is no different from the rising powers that have challenged established powers throughout history. In the early 20th century, Germany was rivaling West European powers of Britain and France. In the second half of the 20th century, a rising Soviet Union was challenging the clearly dominant power in the world at that time, which was, of course, the United States. Sometimes these conflicts have ended peacefully, like the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Sometimes they have not ended peacefully, such as the two world wars that Germany got involved in the early part of the 20th century. So the outcome of these conflicts, these tensions between rising powers and established powers is by no means clear. Let me go on further to say, even though I've suggested or actually said that the Soviet Union lost its challenge to the United States, the Cold War itself never ended. At the time it was going on, most of us assumed it was a conflict between socialism and capitalism. But really, it turns out that it was a conflict between open and democratic societies and closed and autocratic societies. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not end that dynamic. That's why today's conflicts that the United States and West Europe are having with both Russia and China are an extension of that underlying tension. That culture clash continues, and we need to learn how to manage it. Now, there is no historical precedent for such polar opposite societies, economies, and political systems to successfully achieve economic integration. We should not be surprised if we've encountered difficulties. What we need to do is get smarter about managing those difficulties. First thing I would say is we need to be certain not to succumb to the inevitability of military conflict. It is a possibility, but it's by no means the most desirable possibility. I'll say as an American, I don't consider it desirable. And I'll say on behalf of the Chinese people, they have no interest in that as an outcome. So both sides need to learn how to manage this conflict. We need to accept the reality of mutual deterrence. We did coexist with the Soviet Union for 40 plus years, even without enjoying the significant economic, trade, and investment relationship that we now have with China, and we've had with China now for several decades. Mutual deterrence is a way to live successfully in a relationship that has inherent conflict built into it. It works. We've seen it work. Certainly in my lifetime, we've seen it work, and I see no reason why we can't repeat a successful relationship, balanced relationship that we did enjoy for many years with the Soviet Union. The China case should be easier to achieve because we enjoy such a mutually beneficial, or we already have a mutually beneficial economic relationship with China, which we did not have with the Soviet Union. What can we do? Well, the first thing we need to do is avoid reflexive opposition to anything that China says or does. Everything that China says or does is not contrary to our interests. That's an important lesson to learn, and we need to repeat it to ourselves over and over. We've experienced a mutually beneficial relationship with China for several decades. That relationship can continue to be mutually beneficial. We also need to accept that China now is a major economic, military, and political player in the global system. We need to acknowledge that, and they need to understand that we acknowledge that. There is no longer only one superpower in the world. At the same time, China's notion that the American century is over is equally ridiculous to our attempts to say that China needs to be subordinate to us. Both are unrealistic expectations of each other. It's a conflict that the only outcome that's assured is that neither side will overcome the other. Both sides have a vested interest in learning to manage this conflict. We need, for example, to spare our outrage and indignation over unimportant matters. I want to call your attention to the spy balloon episode, which is a perfect example of an absolutely ridiculous outcome. We spy on China, China spies on us. We know it. They know it. Why did we need to make such a big deal over the spy balloon? And why did they need to make such a big deal over our shooting down a spy balloon that lost no Chinese lives? It's a good example of adversaries that were poised to engage in conflict behavior rather than to avoid conflict behavior and engage in collaborative and cooperative behavior. A very important issue for the United States is, as a democratic society, there's constant domestic political competition, and we frequently confuse that with foreign policy making. Probably the most difficult challenge, or one of the most difficult challenges facing the Biden administration now, is the race to be the political party that's toughest on China. That effort on the part of the Democrats to outscore the Republicans in this area and the Republicans to outdo the Democrats in this area does not help U.S. China relations. Both parties need to put aside their competition, totally legitimate on domestic issues, and leave China out of their competition for political power. At the same time, we do need to cultivate the elements in China that are interested in cooperation with the United States, and I think we're failing to do that. We need to encourage cultural and educational exchanges. We need to encourage research cooperation while recognizing that research cooperation will not take place in strategic areas involved in national defense. We need to encourage business activity. A large segment of the Chinese population is interested and invested. They are also invested in preserving ties with the United States. We need to make an appeal to those elements in China rather than the elements in China that are interested in conflict with the United States. For example, President Biden should act on his 2020 presidential campaign promise to end the Trump tariffs on goods from China. These tariffs are a tax on Americans. I'm tired of paying that tax, and eliminating them would boost trade between the two countries and have a very positive symbolic value. These, as President Biden explained during the 2020 presidential campaign, these tariffs are doing us no good and should be eliminated. Finally, we need to avoid allegations of disloyalty or references to disloyalty or suggestions of disloyalty of the Chinese American population. First, these allegations or insinuations are unfounded. Our great advantage in any international competition, and we are in competition with China, is the multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy that we enjoy. We squander that advantage when people of Chinese heritage face discrimination here. And let me assure you, the Chinese government is happy to point that out. We need to be our best selves in order to fare well in the competition that's ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for that well thought out presentation. And also, I want to thank you for the long time commitment, dedication to build a people-to-people friendship between St. Louis and Nanjing. Again, on my recent visit to China, I was asked very often by taxi drivers that do Americans really hate us? Or another driver actually said, America can't be that bad, right? There are so many people lined up at the consulate getting visa to visit. Apparently, depending on what he's reading or watching. But next, I'd like to actually turn to Hangge, who, like me, we actually grew up in another outside United States. And so as Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, we definitely appreciate the comment Joe had shared about the, potentially becoming collateral damage between the two giants. But Hangge, given your unique background, I would love to hear your thoughts about the de-risk. What does it mean for the very intertwined trade and investment connections in the world? At one time, I think when Biden came on, the catchphrase we heard was, we want a trade policy for the workers, right? We want a foreign policy for the middle class. And apparently China was to be blamed for a lot of the workers and loss and then our gutted manufacturing. But how does that look from your perspective, given your expertise in the area of trade and investment?
Okay, thank you, Ming. I really enjoy Ed and Joe's remarks on the U.S.-China relation. I think since given my background, I think I focus my talk on the economic relationship between the two countries. As you know that the topic of our discussion really changed from decoupling to the risk. I mean, as Ed pointed out, but I want to highlight that in the early part of the trade war in 2018, that people talk about decoupling because decoupling is basically an extreme version of the two relationship. And of course, as it go by, then the decoupling sounds too extreme. Then we changed the conversation to de-risk, which is more appropriate, and because it involves how to manage the relationship between the two countries. But be that as it may, doesn't mean that changing the major discussion to de-risk means the two countries are in good terms. Okay, but as you can say, there are conflicting underlying trends between the two countries that still persistent today. The conflicting, of course, is the decoupling. The decoupling idea is still ongoing. As the tariff started in 2018 and then rise 20%. So as Joe pointed out, that given the tariff is no good for consumer, then of course many people suffer. And at the same time, as you know, that Biden imposed restrictions on policies and blacklisted many Chinese high-tech company that U.S. cannot invest, cannot export chips to those company. Having said that, but that still does not stop Biden to continue the decoupling process. For example, in early part of August, he continues to impose the executive order that to block and regulate high-tech U.S. investment in China in terms of computer chips, quantum information technologies, and artificial intelligence. That really imposed tremendous pressure on China because the purpose is really trying to block China's growth in terms of high-tech area. And along with that, and also because the administration tried to tighten investments from China into the U.S. So the CFIUS, that means the Committee of Foreign Investment in U.S., become much more stringent in terms of applying rules accepting Chinese investment into the U.S. So as you can see historically, for the past several years, that the Chinese investment in U.S. become much reduced. So that is very clear. And at the same time, that the also U.S. monitor investment into China. So you can see both ways that U.S. investment in China also reduced as well. So that is really prevailing trend, which does not end due to the risk discussion. Okay, but there's two things which really support the idea of the risk idea. For example, when we look at the trade issues, since the tariff started, that from 7% to 20%, then you expect the China export to U.S. dropped tremendously, which in case is true. In 2019 and 2020 and 21, the trade China's export to U.S. really dropped. But surprisingly, starting 2021 and 22, the China export to U.S. increased. Okay, the increase, of course, according to the statistics, the increase may reflect the increasing demand of U.S. consumers on Chinese goods, or alternatively, that some U.S. company violate certain rules that ship things to China or import things from China. Okay, so that's a possible. But having said that, the import, China's import to U.S. to export to U.S. still continue. It's not as people expect going down. So that I think that is the, given the increasing trend of China's export, that we have to really worry about how to manage the relationship. Of course, we understand that the national security issues that is out there. So I think the conflicting trend is really how to have a creative solutions to balance the national security issue vis-a-vis the interests of the consumer and the business firms. The other favorable aspect of the de-risk idea is one issue is very common that noted is Chinese company listed many investment on the U.S. stock exchanges, and in total, they're exceeding more than 1.3 trillion US dollars in terms of market value. So that cannot be ignored. But according to US law, the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, that the agency have the right to audit and check the books of the Chinese firm listed on the US exchanges. But according to the Chinese law, that those books should not be monitored or audited by foreigners. So that's a conflict between the two countries. So in order to, but I think both countries come to the senses and work out a very meaningful solutions. That is, they use Hong Kong as a base to audit the books, because all the Chinese firm information can be shipped to Hong Kong, which is within the national security, national boundary. And when US agency regulators can come to Hong Kong and check the books, that also can allow US firms or US regulators to conform with the laws. So I think that is a very creative solutions to solve the conflict between the two countries. So I think the two conflicting trend, the decoupling trend, and also the risk trend are ongoing. And then I think we need to find creative solutions, how to manage the two conflicting trends, and in order for future development. As Ed pointed out, that we cannot ignore China, and we have to continue to do business with China. And so, and it's good for both countries. It's beneficial for both countries. So I think the issue is really how to continue our early relationship and make a very promising solutions and steps towards that end.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Hangge. There are a few questions submitted. Definitely feel free to look at them if you want to answer any of them, but I was going to ask actually a quick question for Ed. Ed, you made an interesting comment about now that you're retired, you can say whatever you like, be more blunt, because we have noticed that some of your former peers, they are very quiet in making comments. And one of the questions from the audience actually is about the example you gave. They were wondering, maybe that was an example of maybe Emerson was not on the leveling playing field with against Chinese company, or maybe the Chinese company wasn't playing by the rules, as some of the complaints we hear often. So again, it's kind of loaded question. One is, why do you think some of the business leaders will not speak up as vocally? Two is, do you think it was true that the Chinese side was not giving American company a level playing field?
Yeah, well, on the second one, unfortunately, it was a level playing field, but they had leverage that we did not have. And that leverage gave them a cost. And we, people will complain when a foreign competitor comes in at a lower cost, but if they come in with 96% of the world's population behind them to our 4%, they have a lot more leverage. And is that unfair? No, it's fair. It's why it's important for us. The Germans, in modern history learned this. They have to go out. The Japanese learned this in modern history. They have to go compete in the global economy to support the local economy. So it wasn't cheating. It was being outsmarted, if anything. But yeah, that's why it hurts me. So, but why don't we hear more business people? And this is on the blunt category. The U.S. China Business Council reaches out to the U.S. government and reaches out to the government in China to promote policies for cooperation so we can all compete with each other on a level playing field and what needs to be done. The Chinese government responds by saying, please come to Beijing and meet with our senior leaders and let's discuss what needs to be done to make it better. We go to the U.S. government and the U.S. government says, no, no, no. Business people, you are all naive. You do not understand. We in Washington will take care of this relationship. You do not have a part to play. And many of our business leaders have been told that directly. They've been told by our government to be quiet, not to complain, and to let our U.S. government do what they see as necessary. And I'm very uncomfortable with that. I'm very suspicious of that. I don't think it's wise. I think the collective open market leads to better answers than a contrived secret plan in Washington. I really bristle that the government has told the U.S. China Business Council to go away and be quiet. I don't think that's smart.
Wow, thank you for that very straightforward comment. You definitely are enjoying retirement, I can tell. So now, Joe, you mentioned about how we want to bring out the best in us, right? One of the questions in the audience actually about, is China bring out the best of China? How about the human rights record? Is the Chinese government, Chinese people, the low public opinion in the U.S. of China? Maybe there's some good reason behind it. What's your thoughts about that question?
Well, there are some good reasons. China does not have a very good record on human rights. I have no problem with saying that. I have no problem saying that to China. But at the same time, these are the internal affairs of China. I think we have every right, even obligation, to express our opinions about how China treats its own population, including its minority population. But I think that's where that ends. It's an expression of our opinion, and China and the Chinese people will have to deal with that. I think there will be a day of reckoning in China, but it's not going to be because we want it to happen. It's because Chinese people want it to happen. There are a lot of reforms that China needs. For decades, the Chinese government permitted devastating destruction of its own environment, but that's decreased in recent years, not because of complaints from the U.S. or other countries, but because of complaints from China's own people. They want cleaner air to breathe, and I don't blame them. They want cleaner water to drink, and I don't blame them. And I think we need to say our piece, whether it's about environmental issues or human rights issues, but understand that real change in China is only going to come from inside of China. It's not going to come because the United States or any other foreign country wants to impose that change on China. So I don't have a problem with saying that, for example, the example that's most often given now is the shabby treatment of the Uyghur population. It really does seem inhumane and certainly deserves criticism. I've said it, that's it. It's now the obligation of the Chinese people to make that change if they think it's needed. And I suspect they will think it's needed.
Thank you for that response. By the way, I do encourage you to look at some of the questions, see if some of them actually Dr. Glassman would address directed to you, but I'm going to turn to the Hangei for one more question. So recent economic data coming from China has been very troubling, right? Export, import dropping, deflation. So sometimes people say, oh, be careful what you wish for, right? At one time, people are worried about China getting too strong, too powerful. But right now, almost look like China is almost peaked. What is the risk of this approach I've taken? So the one question, what is the risk of de-risking and for U.S. and China? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the recent economic situation of China are confronted by many ends, not just external, export, import, foreign investment, but also by internal conflict, because you can see there are a lot of internal bankruptcy, default at trust company and real estate company are there. So I think China is facing many issues from different angles, and and also as you know, the hurricanes in China too, okay, the flooding, so China's hands are full, in fact, in many ways. So I think it's really good timing to talk about negotiation between the two countries, because China in economic turmoil, right? And then if U.S. can willing to lend China some help, I think that will provide some gestures for friendship and continue to grow for the relationship.
Right. I still remember Secretary Henry Paulson had shared that during 2008 financial crisis, and then the Chinese side really helped out the U.S. side. So he actually, in his book, he talked about that. I do have another question. It's kind of combining some of the question people raise is, again, at business used to dealing with risk and return. There are different countries with different risk profile. And the current climate, what we are going through, is it good for some business? Is there a winner that is actually benefiting from this very bad U.S.-China relationship right now? Is there anyone out there that's kind of?
No, I think if the U.S. and China are the two biggest economies in the world. You add them together, and it's just so very important. And if the U.S.-China relationship gets worse, the whole world suffers. I think there's no question on that. There's no winner. There may be niches, but any big picture, it's really incumbent on all of us to make sure that the U.S.-China relationship improves, because it impacts everyone and the standard of living of everyone. I think it's very important. When we were together last time, we talked a little bit about the likelihood of war with China. And I told you that I was working with companies where the U.S. Navy had come in and said, be ready for war in 2025 and things like that. I had the opportunity to have dinner with a retired general from the Central Command recently. And I said, what's the likelihood of war with China? And he said, very low, because no one wins, as was pointed out before. But there's going to be noise around it, and it's going to scare me. It's going to scare others. But everything that I've heard says there is no winner in that war. We have to go for a path of cooperation and mutual problem solving. Any other path hurts everyone.
Well, thank you for that remark. Again, we like a lot of good discussions. We run out of time to address all the questions. We will document all the questions, and if our panelists are willing, we may follow up with them to see if you can answer some of the questions. But I would like to ask each of you maybe to comment a bit more about what can we do. And as Joe mentioned, we are multi-racial, diverse, democratic country, And each of us, as said, you know, we all need to really be concerned about this very consequential relationship. What are some of the thoughts, ideas you have that individuals or NGOs or community like us can do to really maybe balance some of the rhetoric from politicians either eager to get a vote, you know, doing the China bashing strategy? And maybe we start from Joe. Any thoughts about what we can do? What will be helpful?
Well, I think we're doing it. I think organizations like U.S. Heartland China Association are doing that. And what you're doing is pointing out the value in the relationship, that this is not something of no value to Americans, it's something of real value to Americans. And I think that's what people have to understand. The second is we have to grow past the idea that in a relationship, it's either all good or all bad. There are a lot of relationships that the United States has with other countries where we have problems, but we work on solving those problems. We have issues with such good friends and allies as Britain, France, Germany. They're good friends and have been now for many years. But that doesn't mean we don't have issues that we disagree with them on, and we don't think that we are likely to resort to violent conflict with them because we have disagreements. So we need to first focus on the good things in the relationship and what we would sacrifice if the relationship was to completely go off the rails. And second, we need to understand that conflict is a normal part of international relationships, and that we need to, in some ways, get smarter and lower our expectations about what our relationship with China can be. I think some of us who have been advocates of this U.S.-China economic relationship and friendship relationship may have oversold the relationship at the beginning, may have suggested that we were going to become just like each other. Well, I don't think we're on the verge of becoming just like each other. We're a long way from becoming just like each other. But that doesn't mean that the alternative is head-on conflict that leads to war. It means that we have tempered our expectations of each other, and we understand that there are going to be a lot of bumps in the road, and that a lot of hardworking, smart people on both sides are going to have to figure out ways to work through those problems. I think that can be done. Remember, we had conflict with the Soviet Union for 40 years, and there was very little holding that relationship together, unlike the very robust economic relationship that we have with China, where they buy billions of dollars worth of American goods, and we buy tens of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods each year. That's a very good foundation to continue to build on.
Wonderful, thank you. Now I'm going to turn to Hangye and then finish with Ed. Hangye, any thoughts about what can we do to prevent a lose-lose situation for both countries?
I just read articles on the survey of U.S. opinion of China and U.S. And the survey is conducted by Pew Research Center. And the one shocking thing about the finding is starting 2017, okay? And then the percentage of have unfavorable opinion of China shoots up. And the percentage of favorable opinions of China goes down tremendously. So there's a divergent opinion of the two groups. That means, so the gap really is increasing. So I think, as you know, that policymakers will base on democratic opinions. If the American in general have unfavorable opinions of China, then of course the policy may be much more serious, much more severe, stringent on China. So I think, so I agree with Joe that the different need to be realistic, and then we do some education on the American that that two countries are very different. Okay, and then we should not expect they are like us, and like Americans. So and then have a more realistic perspective of the two countries, and that's the job of the NGO and some other organization, educational organization, should do to have more realistic portrait of the two countries, so that they can lead to a better outcome.
Thank you. I will share that about the Pew Research. A lot of people were saying, did they ask question of, are you fully aware the potential cost of if you and China have a war, right? Did they ask that question?
Right.
Because when you hear, actually one of our strategic advisor, Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, noted how in Iowa every day the Republican ads is bashing China, and again, public opinion is heavily influenced by mainstream media these days as well. So sometimes it's a cycle that the American public media and public opinions are, really linked to each other. But thank you for sharing that. So Ed, would you like to close us the session with what you think we can do to help prevent lose-lose situation?
Well, the first and most important thing is not to isolate ourselves. Don't let the United States become isolationists. Don't let us pull away. And that means we have to be involved in the political dialogue. And the business leaders that are out there that have been told to be quiet, don't be quiet. Talk about what's important for economic viability, what's important for economic growth, what's important to enhance the quality of life in the United States. The quality of life is enhanced by globalizing our businesses, our leading businesses, where we're very good. So that's the first thing. But really, what I keep running into is people are afraid to compete with China because, like your previous question, were they cheating somehow? And they were thinking about the way it was 30 years ago, not the way it is right now. North America has made tremendous progress in the ability to compete over many, many years. North America can compete with anyone, including China. So we shouldn't be afraid. What we should be afraid of is not competing. That should scare us, because if we don't compete, then we will lose our edge. And when we lose our edge, then our way of life and our economic well-being will be hurt. So, just fight the isolationism, stand up and talk, stand up and say what you believe, and don't let someone tell you you have to be quiet. Don't accept that.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for sharing your insights, and we really appreciate it. This session is going to be recorded for replay, and we will share the additional questions that we don't have time to address. And hopefully we will be able to connect with more Heartland community through those Q&A follow-ups. And again, thank you again, Ed and Joe and Hangge. Always so wonderful to see you again. It's Heartland leaders like you that keep us inspired at the Heartland China Association. We look forward to seeing you and working with you in the near future.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.